Hi, here we are, another episode. Today's guest was somebody else that we met on Twitter. That's happening a lot lately. And I reached out to him just because I really liked his Twitter feed and his intelligence and his calm demeanor in which he tweets. So having said that, meet Tony Corsnino. Thank you,
Welcome.
Tony.
Hi. Hello. Thank you so much for having me on. This is
Thank you
just
for coming.
lovely.
So we're going to kind of just jump right in. What is your adoption story, or how do you want to tell your story to us?
Well, I grew up as an only child. I am my adoptive parents' only child. And I was always aware throughout my life of having been adopted. I can't really remember a moment when I was told. It just feels like it was, in that respect, a part of my identity from the start. I didn't really think much about searching or knowing more about my ancestry and my roots and my origins until I was about early 20s, like 23, 24 or so.
Where were you adopted? Where did you grow up?
I was adopted in Birmingham, Alabama. Yeah. So lived in Birmingham until the age of 8. My father was a real estate developer in Birmingham and moved us, my mother and me, and the family dog to Northwest Florida when I was 8. Yeah, and so I grew up in Northwest Florida, went to college at Florida State University in North Florida, and then got married and moved up to the Boston area for graduate school. Yeah, and so then during the first couple of years of graduate school, I began to think in a way that I hadn't really before about the possibility of finding my mother.
And were you close to your parents growing up, your adoptive parents?
I was very, very close with both of them, but especially with my adoptive mother, who loved me with a, kind of white hot intensity. I always felt like I was the most important and valuable thing in her life and her entire existence. It was something that as I got older, I began to become more self-conscious of. It was something that some people in my life sort of indicated to me that they had noticed as well, that there's just seemed to be a real closeness, and almost, I wouldn't say desperation, but just a real feeling of intense, love, belonging, ownership, possession.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was quite a blow, really, when a couple of years before I started thinking about searching, we lost her. She died. I was, 20 years old. I was, working through my studies in college. And I don't have very, very clear or detailed or precise memories of all of those events. There was just, there was a lot of grief, sadness, and a fair amount of ugliness that happened between the various parts of my family after my mother passed. So, I think that's when I think about my sense of myself and the way that I formed my identity growing up. It's important to me to keep in mind that I was my adopted mother's only child, and that bond that we had was extremely intense.
Yeah, that's a big loss at that age too, for a son and a mom. And Sarah and I have boys in their 20s. That's big for you, what you had to go through.
It was, and I wasn't prepared to handle it like a grown-up. So it was a situation in which I basically let other adults in my life
handle it.
take care of all of the arrangements, clearing out the house that she and I lived in. That was something that was done by other people in my life. I had just found a couple of days ago a box of old photographs that my mother's sister had saved and archived for me. And I think that she did that at around the time of my mom's passing. And that box is among the few tangible physical artifacts that I have of really any part of my childhood. And in part, it was because when she passed, I was very young and not thinking about, how to tie up loose ends, what to do next. So yeah. A couple of years after that happened, when I was in graduate school up here in Boston, I, thought that it was time to think about searching. I didn't know what the resources were. I didn't know anything about, and in fact, I really didn't even investigate what the status of the laws governing adoption and birth records were in my state of adoption, Alabama. I just went online, I think this was pre-Google. I may have used, what was it, like Alta Vista or one of those other search engines or whatever to find.
Earthlink.
Yeah, right. Something like that. And, what I came across was the International Soundex Reunion Registry, the ISRR. For people who may not know, it's a voluntary registry in which adoptees and birth parents can register independently of each other if they seek contact with each other, and then those records are compared, and if there's a match, then the registry arranges to put adoptees and birth parents in contact with each other. So I, created a file in Soundex Reunion Registry, and nothing happened. So after a brief kind of dalliance with searching, I just didn't think about it again for a number of years until 2007 happened. So I was doing this rather cursory searching at around 1999, 2000. In 2007, a couple of big things happened in my life. I was diagnosed with cancer, and that was probably the stimulus for my wife and myself to try to conceive a child, because all of a sudden there was this existential question of life and death looming over us. And so we did conceive a child that year. And then, once I became a parent, the gears began to turn a little bit, and I began to think more about what I owed my child. In particular, obviously, what I owed them by way of family medical history or health history. But again, I didn't really act on any of these thoughts.
It's quite common, I think, too. When that happens, we all have the gears start going,
Yep. Yes. Yeah, it seems to be your story repeated over and over again among adoptees that having children is a stimulus that kind of gets things moving. A couple of years after the birth of our first child, we had a second. That was in 2011. And a couple of years after that, in 2013, once again, I started thinking about what I owed them, and decided that it was time to search again, thinking that at this point, online resources for searching might have gotten a bit more sophisticated. Some time had passed. And I discovered when I went online, to my amazement, that maybe a year or so after I had originally and tentatively and almost half-heartedly tried searching, that the legislature in the state of Alabama had repealed its law that it had passed in 1990, sealing birth records from adoptees. So Alabama had been something of an outlier state in the broader history of adoption law in the United States, because even though state after state from the 40s through the 70s were passing laws that blocked adoptees from having access to their birth records, Alabama was one of the outliers with a small handful of other states. But then that state also sealed its birth records to adoptees in 1990, but then in 2000, they repealed it. And, that came as quite a shock to me, because I'm sitting there wondering, kind of bashing myself in the head, asking myself, why didn't I know this? Why didn't I try to educate myself about this? I could have searched a lot earlier. I could have searched 13 years earlier than I did, or at least gotten this document. And it just turned out to be a completely straightforward process. It almost felt to me like it was, to me, it felt like being able to buy a drug that had been, illegal for forever. Like all of a sudden,
marijuana,
right?
Instead of buying a joint legally,
Yeah.
now I can purchase for $25 my original birth certificate from the Department of Vital Records in Montgomery, Alabama.
I think it's fascinating that Alabama is so progressive. I mean, I'm from a state that still doesn't have that, so that's crazy.
It is interesting the way the way adoption issues do kind of scramble, familiar and conventional political divisions, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It is pretty interesting, and it's one of those topics that, as a former academic, I'd love to see more work done on it, like a detailed history of why it is that things change in the way they did in some places and not in others.
There's a lot about adoption that I wish they would do more research on, specifically how many, one thing, private investigators are adoptees, how many alcoholics are adoptees. There's a lot that I'd like to know. But
yeah. Right. So I went ahead and filled out the application and sent my check for $25 or whatever it was. And then a couple of months later, so that I had done that in like August of 2013, in November of 2013, I got this big envelope in the mail, from Montgomery, Alabama. And I can't remember exactly how I felt when I held that unopened envelope in my hand, but certainly when I opened it and I pulled out this sheaf of documents, my original birth certificate, some of the initial adoption papers, and then the final decree of adoption, all bundled together with nothing at all redacted. When I was sitting there and looking at my original birth certificate, and I beheld for the first time ever my mom's name in her young, sort of, neat, loopy cursive, right there on the name field of the mother on my original birth certificate, I just changed. I don't know a better way to describe it, but I all of a sudden, really very suddenly, realized that what I needed wasn't just to supply some information of value to my own children and to myself, right? Health history, but I needed to know her if I could. So it wasn't even like I was sitting there and debating whether I wanted to reach out it was just something about seeing that name. So I ran over to my computer and sat down and Google searched her name. Her name is unique, and no other records for anyone else popped up except records that pertain to her. And in particular, there was one piece of information that was really useful, and I mean, but the circumstances are quite sad. During the same month that I had requested my birth certificate, her father, my grandfather, died. And so there was the funeral home had put up a kind of obituary page where you can leave messages and notes and expressions of condolences and things like that. And so the obituary stated, all of his children, names of their children, and it was very easy then to start finding people. And I'd like to say that I deliberated carefully about how to proceed, having all of this identifying information, but I wasn't careful. I reopened my Facebook account, which I had basically abandoned a couple of years prior to that. And I found that two of her siblings had Facebook pages. And so I sent out direct messages to each of them. And from what I can remember, the first one was really kind of cagey and almost sneaky in its language. I think my attitude was like, I think I might know who you are, or I think that you might recognize me. I think I might be your nephew. Not trying to stir the pot or anything. I was just very cagey, and I hadn't really found an authentic voice, I think, for expressing what I was hoping to do. And in fact, I didn't get a response. Then I sent a message to my uncle, in which I was just much more open about it. Here's who I am. Here's who I believe my mother is.
And she wasn't on Facebook, your mother?
She was not, no. Huh. Here's who I think my mother is. And I would love to be able to meet you, or at least get to know you or talk to you if you feel comfortable with doing that, and if you feel comfortable with sharing this information with her. And my uncle replied very graciously. In fact, I think ultimately they both did. Both my aunt, who I had reached out to first, and then my uncle, and they were both quite gracious, and they said, the gist of it was, we certainly know who you are. We are glad finally to hear from you, and we're going to be having a family Christmas get together next month, and we're going to sit down with your mother, and we're going to talk about what she would like to do next. And
that's really incredible, actually. I think it's not everybody's experience. I think it's neat.
Yeah, I want to come back to that because I'm still struck by it. So then,
and this was how long ago?
This was in 2013.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was out of town on Christmas vacation with my family when I got an email. I got several emails from different people, but the one that I remember most clearly was from another of my mom's sisters, who explained to me that she was the person who arranged for my mom to live in Birmingham, Alabama while she was pregnant with me. She came down from Pennsylvania. That's where she got pregnant with me. And her sister, who was doing volunteer work in Birmingham, was able to find a place for my mom to stay while she was pregnant with me. There is a street address on my original birth certificate, and when you run it in Google Maps, it just shows an empty field, which I found mysterious. But it turns out that there was a farm there at one point, and my mom lived in a farmhouse, and during my pregnancy, so yeah. So
how old was she?
She was 21. Yeah, she was 21 when she gave birth to me. Yeah.
And was she from Pennsylvania, or she just happened to be in Pennsylvania?
The family was in Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Okay.
That's where her parents lived. Yeah, and she was going to school at a small college in Pennsylvania. So yeah, she spent the remainder of her pregnancy in Alabama. So I got an email from her sister who had arranged that. And one of the things that just kind of made me weak in the knees was my aunt's remark that she was the first person to hold me in her arms after I was born, and that's just kind of like that one of those birth story facts that people who aren't adopted, I'll probably hear so often that they become tired of it. But here I am, I'm a 39-year-old man, and I'm hearing for the first time my birth story. I'm hearing, from the woman who held me in her arms for the first time. And that was a really, really, really powerful thing. hear. So it was a lovely letter that she wrote. And then at that point, and again, this was either Christmas Day or the day after Christmas. So they made this decision to reach out to me, I think probably immediately after talking with my mom about what happened. So yeah, so then we started corresponding and emailing photos back and forth.
With your aunt, but not with
your mom.
With my aunt, and then with my mom.
Okay.
Then yeah, I think she emailed me first. I have all of these, I have all these messages archived in Gmail, but I actually haven't gone back recently and looked at the text of them. But yeah, she and I started talking, and we shared a lot of photos with each other, and then made plans for an in-person reunion. And it just, not to liken myself to a hero, but it just felt like that aspect of the stereotypical hero's journey. We had set a date to meet in March of 2014. So I, walk from my house over to the car rental place to rent a car to make this trip. And it's a 370-mile drive just straight along US 90, the Mass Turnpike to the New York State Thruway. And, I'm just driving into an unknown future. I mean, it was just, it felt like quite an extraordinary journey into the unknown, clearly. And the way we had arranged it was that I would go to her apartment first and meet with her one-to-one. And then we would, after an initial meeting, we would go to another of her sisters' home, because it turns out that I have 3 of them who live in the same town, my mom and 2 of her sisters. So that's what happened. I drove to my mom's apartment, and I pushed the little buzzer, and I was buzzed in, and that was an interesting sensation to be buzzed in by my mom, whom I have never seen in person. And then I knock on her door, and there she is. And so of course we embrace, and we sit down, and we just I think we just kind of looked through a couple of photo albums. I think that was how we sort of started to converse and kind of get to know each other. And then we went over to my aunt's house. And what I had done is I had made a lasagna, which this incredibly labor-intensive lasagna where you have to make the bechamel from scratch, and you have to, there's like 3 different kinds of ground meat, and you have to cook the noodles in advance and layer everything carefully, and it's just such a pain in the butt to make.
Sounds delicious.
Like a fancy lasagna like this. But I just wanted to be I just felt like I just wanted to be a good son and nephew. So
always
yeah.
that people pleasing thing going on with us adoptees.
Bring the lasagna to your.
I wanted to make a good impression. I really just wanted to do that.
Oh yeah.
And so yeah. So after we sat on the couch together and talked for a little while and looked over some pictures, and
did you feel emotional?
Very much, yeah.
Yeah.
So my mom has a very, she has a very warm but placid affect, very sweet, very loving, but also not demonstrative. So it wasn't like we were both embracing each other tearfully and holding each other's hand. It wasn't like that. She gave me a hug, and then we it really kind of from the start sort of set the tone for how we are with each other, which is just very relaxed and just in a way, just a couple of grown-ups.
And she must have given you the circumstances of the relinquishment.
Yes, she did. In fact, she had, even prior to the meeting, she had told me a few things that she wanted to share with me about the circumstances of my relinquishment. So one thing that she had told me again prior to our meeting was the name of my father. You know, and I think it's important for me to point out that she describes the relinquishment as an entirely voluntary act, you know, not coerced in the sense of having authority figures demand or pressure her or threaten her into relinquishing, but that she owns the decision and regards herself as having had full agency over it.
I'm struck by your story because I haven't met my biological mom because she passed away, but I have letters from her with the same intent and was very strong about that.
Right.
And so hearing you, I'm like, oh, that's just, your whole story is resonating.
Yeah. You know, I mean, one of the things, just to kind of break the reunion narrative here for a moment, one of the books that I think I had actually read this book even before. I read a lot. This is what I do to cope with, you know, just anything that, you know, that anything that I find confusing or difficult to manage or major or, you know, substantial in my life, I try to read about it. I mean, certainly when I was diagnosed with cancer, I was reading like mad about the kind of cancer that I had to get some sense of what I could expect. And, you know, this is how I comfort myself with trying to just reading. So I had read a number of, and I had never done anything like remotely like this before in my life, but I read a number of books about adoption, really mainly from the adoptees and birth mothers' points of view. I skimmed a little bit of The Primal Wound. That was a book that I came across early. It's kind of hard to escape when you know, Google adoption book or anything like that. The Primal Wound is going to be one of the first things to come up. I also got acquainted with some of Betty Jean Lifton's writings. And then another book that really hit me was Ann Fessler's book, The Girls Who Went Away, the you know, the hidden history of the women who surrendered children before Roe v. Wade. And so I had a lot of those narratives in my head because in that book, birth mothers repeatedly tell stories of having been coerced, of wishing that they had the resources and the support to keep their child, but they were given really no option. They had no family support. They had no financial support. And then they went away to some of these places that were, you know, that could range from feeling something like summer camp to prison, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I had these narratives kind of lodged in my head, and yeah, and then when I started talking with my mom, I kind of stood respects in which her own story was somewhat similar to that, because, you know, if you know, a pregnant woman making the decision to relinquish a child, you know, may do so in part because there are no family members who are able or willing to provide assistance. And, you know, so I think I could speculate and infer things about what kind of support maybe she did or didn't have in her own family. It's really, you know, that's pure speculation. But certainly I kind of had that question in my mind, like, you know, when we think about what it is to say that a decision to relinquish is truly voluntary, right? Like,
Right.
Okay, well, what are the constraining factors that might have entered into that decision, even if it's important for the mother to say that it was a voluntary decision?
Because it might have changed if there's certain factors were different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. But right, she, for her, that it was the right decision to make. Now, the other part of it, which is what happens in the future. So with these stories of relinquishment in Ann Fessler's book, time and time again, birth mothers talk about how they always wanted to find their children again. Like the lost child, they wanted to find them again. So that for them, relinquishment wasn't something that they were willing to conceive of as a permanent severance, as a permanent, lifelong, irrevocable event. And what I came to learn about my mom is that she certainly didn't think of severance in that way either. And I think that's important because, I think the story that is often told about adoption, certainly in that period, is that, and it was something that I think I just absorbed in my own childhood, which is that there was this woman who gave birth to you, but she wanted you to have a better life in another family who could take care of you, and she wanted them to make you their own, right? So this kind of transfer of all of the roles and statuses of parenthood from the birth mother to the adoptive parents, but that kind of notion of permanence, that's not something that she had, because she herself, as I learned, had searched for me at around the same time that I was searching for her the first time around, at least. So she was looking for some closure. She was looking to get some kind of connection
Answer.
back to me. Yeah.
Did she have any other kids?
No, she didn't.
Never did.
She did not. Yeah.
Did she not have an interest in having children? I mean, was that a piece of letting you go?
I think, well, there are other factors at work. I think that she came to realize that well, there were personal factors in her life that led her to think that she herself wouldn't be able to raise a child with the kind of care and attention that she would be able to give a child, and it has to do with personal struggles, mental health stuff.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And before you go on, did she tell you? She told you your biological father's name.
She did.
And what was their relationship at the time?
They were dating,
Mhm.
and then and then they weren't.
Yeah.
Sounds like my biological parents.
Yeah.
Mine too.
So yeah, but anyway, I think reading Ann Fessler's book gave me a kind of a template for a narrative that I was comparing my mom's narrative against. And so I was really thinking of it from that framework, like, to what extent was she coerced in making the decision to relinquish? And what was her feeling about finding me again? And so there were elements that were kind of similar, and elements that were a little bit different from some of the stories that I read in Fessler's book. So coming back to the reunion story, she and I drove over to my aunt's house, and then there were all of her surviving siblings, 3 sisters, a brother, and I met them all. And
that's an out-of-body experience.
that was an out-of-body
Yeah.
experience. It was all happening in the span of a couple of hours.
Were
right?
there
So,
any cousins?
I do have a couple of cousins. One of whom I know. I've seen her several times at my aunt's house. And we're friends on Facebook. I have other cousins from another sibling whom I have not met. But my cousin was not present at this dinner. So what was going on in my mind as I'm sitting there with all of these people? The first thing that struck me was just the genetic mirroring stuff that I've been thinking so much about. Just the fact that I'm looking at these people and I'm saying, oh yeah, that's what I look like. I have your nose and I have your eyes. And then as we sat down to have dinner, there was more that began to come out. Like, you may notice that I'm sitting here and I'm moving my hands in a certain way. Well, several of my aunts and uncles move their hands in similar ways, you know? And I noticed that things that I felt like I was able to make them laugh with some of my stupid jokes. Now, of course, we're all trying to be on our best behavior with each other, so maybe one can't read too much into those kinds of signals. But it just seemed like maybe we shared a sense of humor, similar kinds of sensibilities. One thing that I really enjoyed noticing was that my aunt, at whose home we were having this dinner, she is she has an advanced degree. She has a PhD, a nursing PhD, and she had some of her books from her academic life on the bookshelf, including several philosophy books and history books that I myself have read. And this was particularly striking to me because I didn't grow up in a house where there were any scholarly monographs lying around. Mm-hmm. That was no part of my family experience and my adoptive family growing up.
And yet you went that way. You went that way as an adult. I
did, yeah. And then I was to discover, as I learned more about my family, that two of the siblings got PhDs. One, I believe it was can't remember if it's a mathematics or physics PhD at the University of Pittsburgh, and then my aunt, who has a PhD in psychiatric nursing. And then I learned that several of the others have postgraduate degrees, and one was an English teacher, I think both at the college and school level. And so I discovered that I'm in this family of kind of, nerds, scholars,
intellectuals,
people, intellectuals. I don't know, but I mean, I'm coming to their house, and I've got a PhD too, and I'm just struck by this. I think a lot about what we share in virtue of our genetic kinship, and obviously any adoptee thinks a lot about the nature nurture question. But there were just so many signs to me at different levels, deeper or shallower levels, from the shape of the face to the way someone laughs or gestures, to just choices that people made in their lives that just resembled aspects of myself, that it had a tremendous effect on my own self-image, in the sense of really resolving mysteries about who I was, being placed in that context. Yeah,
that they were so open and welcoming you into their life, and that's not always the case. So
right, it was immediate. Yeah.
You refer to her as your mom. A lot of adoptees, myself included, maybe this is because my adoptive mom is still alive, but I distinguish the two, birth mother and adoptive mother. And is this just, do you call her mom to her?
I don't. I call her by her first name. And I call my adoptive father Dad. Kinship language is tricky for all of us adoptees.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Even when we are just using terms to disambiguate so that people know that we're talking about our mother who gave birth to us rather than the mother who raised us. Even the choice of terminology, even if it's just for the purpose of disambiguating, I've noticed can elicit some controversial, some controversies among adoptees. So I've heard adoptees say that the phrase birth mother is maybe not to be preferred, maybe say first mother or natural mother. These questions about what the import of the phrase is and what kind of connotations it carries. These are all fraught questions. So when in talking about my adoption reunion experience, I was referring to her as my mom. And the reason why I did that is because I knew that in this context, it was pretty clear which of my two moms I was referring to. But in a situation where it might not be clear, I would probably just resort to birth mom or adoptive mom.
That's a very good point Sarah brought up about the language, because we all go through it. How am I going to distinguish this or say this? And
right. Yeah. So then, after that initial meeting in March of 2014, as I say, we really just kind of became a family, in the sense that I just became a bunch of people's nephew, and I became my birth mom's son.
Did you tell your dad about your father about all this?
So I'm trying to remember how it unfolded. I actually think that I reached out to two of his sisters.
No. I mean, your adoptive father.
Right. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
You are you still on speaking terms? Do you talk to him? Are you close to him? I mean,
My adoptive father. Well, we haven't spoken in a while. So the way I decided to manage this revelation, because I had a suspicion that this news was going to be difficult for him to take. And I didn't really know how it would be received by any other members of my adoptive family. So my dad has two younger sisters, both of whom I felt very close to growing up. Loved them dearly, and they were, again, just as was true of so many people in my adoptive family, really just very, warm and loving to me, just embracing me as fully a member of the family. I decided that I was going to try to break it gently, as it were, by reaching out to them first. And I did that. And the loveliest thing happened, which I didn't expect and certainly wasn't counting on. They both told me that they were happy that I had found my birth mom. And they told me something else, which is that they had, for a long time, I don't know how long, among themselves and with their husbands, had wondered whether I was going to search, whether I was going to take that step. So as I said, I wasn't expecting that response, but it was very encouraging. I may have, I may have misjudged the level of acceptance in a way, because after I had those conversations with my two aunts, I had a conversation with my dad, and I told him that I had found my birth mother, and he was very, he was listening quite respectfully, and he was very, sort of cool and almost formal about it. You could just tell that he was listening quietly and maybe very, very intently as I'm telling him, this news. And I don't remember what the context was, but I was talking maybe about how I was going to be taking my kids out to see my mom, in a couple of weeks or something, because at this point, it had been a couple of years since the reunion. Actually, I had kind of waited a while before even broaching this stuff with my adoptive family. And as I said, I kind of became an instant nephew and an instant part of the family. And we established a schedule whereby 2 or 3 times every year, I was driving out to my mom's town with my kids.
I was wondering if your kids knew them. Yeah.
So my children both have really great relationships with my birth family. And my uncle, who lives not in Western New York State, but in Pennsylvania, I've taken my children out to see him and his wife there, and we've visited the Pennsylvania Farm Show and seen the butter sculpture, and we've just been doing aunt and uncle and niece and nephew and family stuff together for a while at this point. So I'm on the phone and I'm telling my dad about some of this. And I think I maybe have casually said something like, so yeah, so in a couple of weeks, I'm going to take the kids out to see my mom again. And then there was a moment's pause, and he said, I have to be honest, I never thought that I would ever hear you use that word for anyone other than your adoptive mom. And it was easy to tell that was hurtful for him to hear. When we talk about how just the choice of language is very fraught for adoptees, that was just a very direct education in that. And that was the last conversation. And this was, I want to say this was something like 4 or 5 years ago. We had that conversation. And I've talked to him since. I traveled to Alabama to be present with my grandmother, his mother, as she lay dying in a hospital. So yeah, I've seen him at least once in person since that conversation. But for me, it was, at this point, my thinking had moved into a different space with respect to adoption, because now I was beginning to move into kind of the aggrieved phase where, and in particular, what I mean by aggrieved is I was beginning to feel angry that it took so long for this to happen, that I had to wait so long to get my original birth certificate. Now, obviously, given what I've told you, I could have done it much sooner than I did. But that's because I didn't know the situation with adoption law in the state of my adoption. But at that point, I was beginning to think about, justice issues. These decisions are being made for us putatively in our best interests, but we have no say in it. There are these other parties that are making these agreements that deprive us access to our identities, to our birth certificates. And we have no say in it, and we just have to be bound by an agreement that other people have made on our behalf as infants. And so I had been moving into that kind of attitude. And I think that brought out a little bit of a forthrightness and assertiveness in me, so that, I kind of knew when I was talking to my dad on the phone that I was doing something substantial by referring to my birth mother as my mom. I kind of knew that it wasn't entirely innocent, but that I was in fact making a point by it. And I judged him for his reaction, I still find, when I hear some stories, some including stories that some of your other guests on the podcast, have related, when I hear stories about the difficulties that adoptive families have in reconciling themselves to what their children are doing to make this part of their lives whole, there's still a part of me that just gets angry about it.
Oh, yeah. Do you think his reaction, I guess my thought was his reaction sounded less to do with him being your father and more to do with a loyalty to his wife?
I was thinking that.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Protectiveness of her.
That was the gut feeling I got when you said that, when you related that.
I'm sure that was part of it. They were estranged. They had separated when I was in my early teens, and I lived with my mom, my adoptive mom. And so they were, in that way out of each other's lives, or the family structure had kind of broken. But as I already said, everybody in the family could tell just by the way my mom and I, and here, I mean, my mom, my adoptive mom, the way my mom and I were with each other, how close a bond we had, that I'm sure that he was thinking about that and about the intensity of the affection that she felt for me when he said that to me. And that for him, for me to use the language that way was maybe a betrayal of him, but possibly primarily betrayal of her and of her.
Mm-hmm.
It's also sticky and complicated.
Very layered.
It is.
Layered.
I mean, I think that we have, just in talking about word choice, we've brought up a bunch of different moral questions that arise about whose feelings are to be respected and what the terms mean. It's just, it's fascinating to me just how thorny it is.
And even hearing your story, I'm thinking of how much we apologize and have to move around and can't just, it's like we're apologizing for something that was done to us, and it's fascinating.
Yeah. The other thing that I would want to say about my relationship with my mom, my adoptive mom, is that, as I said, I lost her when I was young. And it took me, as it happened, it was several years that passed before I allowed myself to take those baby steps toward finding something out about my birth mom. And then it was many years after that before I actually took those little steps that changed me into the, into what I am now. And I've mentioned this on Twitter because I tend to talk a lot about my sort of feelings about adoption and my own adoption experience on Twitter. And something that I come back to over and over again is that if she were still here, I don't know if I would be talking to you right now. I don't know that I would have searched. I don't know if I would have reached out. There's no way for me to know if any of that would have happened. Certainly,
yeah,
it did.
Sarah and I talk about that. We've discussed that.
Is there so obvious next question? Your birth father, your father.
Yeah.
Any context?
We know a little bit about it, but tell
Yeah.
podcast.
I'm still deciding how to proceed. Over the last couple of weeks, I've decided that I wanted to, as it were, make things right by my dads. I've already mentioned that I haven't really talked with my adoptive father very much since that phone call. Because for me, I felt estranged by it. I felt hurt by it. He felt hurt by it. And it's just taken me a while to, I think, bring myself back into a place where I want to kind of reach out again, but I do. And then something else that I decided that I want to do is to let my biological father know that I exist and I'm all right. There are reasons why I suspect that maybe he's not going to want to form much of a relationship. I think that the circumstances of, the way that the relationship between him and my birth mother ended, the news of my pregnancy, I think that was very difficult for him. He married and has 2 sons, my half brothers. I can easily imagine that from his perspective, after all, he didn't carry a child and bring it into the world. I can understand how it would be easier for a father generally just to compartmentalize this as a bad thing that happened and now it's over. The child is gone. It's like the incriminating evidence has been destroyed. And that maybe he would prefer to keep it that way. So I have to keep that in mind as a possibility as I debate how to reach out. And so the way that I've decided to do that is kind of following the advice of somebody that I heard from on Twitter, is see whether I can get some DNA evidence. So I joined Ancestry.com a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to be submitting a DNA sample for the DNA Ancestry part of their service, and see what shows up. See if any of the members of his family tree show up as matches. Because what I've been doing is I've been plotting out. I've been just spending a lot of time plotting out family trees, my biological family tree. At this point, I have good information. Just today, I learned the names of my paternal grandparents.
I saw that.
And so I know that I had an uncle on my father's side who died about 10 years ago. My father's only sibling. And I have yet to figure out whether he had any children. So whether I might have more first cousins that I don't know about yet. That maybe that'll be what I do after our conversation now.
What state are they in? Do you know?
Pennsylvania. Well,
Okay, so everyone
yeah,
is Pennsylvania.
yeah, that's right. I
I'm
have more. Oh, go ahead.
I'm going through this with you, as you know, sort of like, I've done the DNA, so I know that I have that to say, here I am who I am, but I haven't done it either. And I'm sort of circling figuring out the best way to do this. It's very,
Did it pull up matches for you?
Yep, immediately. I knew his name already. And then, yeah, and they're all there. And so it was like immediate. And he's not on Ancestry.
Right. So were there maybe more distant branches of your family who had created some trees, and that's kind of
not even so distant. He's one of many brothers, and a lot of them are on there, and the kids are on there. And I still haven't been able to figure out who's who to who, but a little bit. I know a few of the players. So it's that sort of
Ancestry is amazing. That was how I pieced together, because my birth mother was also adopted.
Yes.
So that was a big mystery to me until just maybe 4 years ago, when I found her side of the family. And
it's
I think I've said this, but out of the 6 kids of my biological grandmother, 4 of them gave up kids for adoption, which is pretty astounding.
That is astounding. I mean, just statistically astounding.
Anyway, you'll probably be going down some rabbit holes on Ancestry once you.
Yeah. I've been down some late night rabbit holes and texting Sarah late at night.
Just plan on many hours going through Ancestry.
I can see what a time suck it is. I've already invested a lot of my time and energy into it all. And just I love looking at people's family photos. Actually, I always have. And not just my own family, but anybody's family photos. There've been times when I've asked people, "Hey, let's look at your family photo album. I'd love to see it." Because I have always been interested in, within and across generation connections and resemblances. I love seeing who looks like whom. I've always been interested in that. Do you think
that's an adoptee thing? Because when you're saying that, I'm like, I've had that too. And Sarah, we both like to look at photos, and that's since I was little, I love to look at that.
I think so.
Yeah.
It's a vicarious experience of genetic mirroring that we don't get to have.
Yeah.
And even if we don't
see it.
Yeah. And even if we don't understand that that's what's driving it, I think that's it's reasonable to think that's what's going on.
I think you're right. I used to stare at my brother when he would eat or do something, and then watch my dad and stare at them to watch, and most people would say, oh, they look so much alike. And that's an obvious, but I would stare at them fascinated how they would have that.
Yeah.
Like watch them for a long time.
When I met my birth mother and 2 of my sisters with her, and they came to stay with my son, he was a baby at the time, and my ex, who actually you look exactly like.
Oh my gosh, it's crazy.
Isn't that crazy? My son's father, I'll have to send you a picture. You look just like him. At any rate, he just sat there. David sat
marveling.
There. Like, he's like, there's 4 of you. We had the same gestures. We all nod our head, just all these things. So it is pretty, it's remarkable actually, when you don't have that. And then
when you don't
get
have it.
It is.
You lack it, and then you're older, and wow.
Yeah.
Well, I know that podcasting is not a visual format, but I'm going to show you a picture that I have stared at for I don't know how many hours. But so this is, I've got a picture here that depicts my birth mother and me both at age 17.
Oh, wow.
And
it's the same face.
Yeah. And I saw that, I grabbed that yearbook photo from, like classmates.com, I think.
Yeah.
And that happened before I met her in person. And yeah, I was hypnotized by that photo, and I just kept looking at it and looking at it and looking at it, so much so that I framed it, and it's in a prominent place in the hallway by my room. And then I have another copy of that yearbook photo of her that's in my bedroom. Yeah, because to me, it's just a token. It's a symbol of a connection that feels so real to me. I think it is really hard to, and I would love to know how you think about this, but I think it's hard to explain why those kind of blood connections are so important to us. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it isn't as important for other adoptees. I certainly don't want to generalize, but just feeling like, just feeling connected to that family tree, and sort of more broadly speaking in the whole kind of global and cosmic tree, is so important that its loss is something that we didn't have it as children, as we're growing up, but it wasn't like something that was taken from us so much as it was never present. And so we didn't, I think, have the language to articulate it.
No.
Maybe some adoptees are more self-aware and will say things like, I want to know who I look like, but I never actually said that. But I had these other indications that this was, I think in many respects in my life, that this had an effect on my sense of identity. I was really interested in other people's family resemblances. I used to think that I was a kind of narcissist because I would stare at myself in the mirror. And now I understand
it doesn't
why.
mean you're not.
Yes. Well, just good old fashioned narcissism. Wow, I'm a hot guy. That could be one of the reasons why I did it. But another part of it is just that I think it was like I was looking at a puzzle.
Oh yeah.
I'm looking at this face. What is this face like? Who is this face like? That inarticulate feeling was always there. And in a broader sense, my sense of being separate from, different, just different from everybody else in my family growing up, that was something that they emphasized in weird respects. Like, I grew up in the Deep South, but I never spoke with a pronounced Southern accent. Everybody else in the family did. Why? I had certain musical talents, as it turned out. And I grew up in a family that is not a musical family, and then I discovered with my birth family that there are artistically creative people. One of my aunts is a very talented poet. My birth mom is a gifted visual artist and graphic designer. In fact, she did that for a living in her young adulthood, and so, yeah, that's that sense of difference, which I think is very much rooted in these genetic connections, was that rootedness wasn't there for me. And I think, what it led to was this sense that maybe I don't have a self, or I don't have a fully, I have an opaque self, that it's a black box at the center of me. But I'd be, because I think this is so important yet so hard to describe to people who don't experience it.
It's very hard to describe it. I used to spend a lot of time in the East Coast as a kid with my family, my adopted families, extended family, my aunts and uncles. And they're really big into their genealogy, and they had the family tree and everything. I always just felt like such a fish out of water. And I was very close to everybody. Love them all. I'm still close to them, but I was always just different than everybody. And I had a brother that looks just like both my parents and acts like my parents. And I didn't have that, and I'd be jealous of it. But, and they made me feel so loved and all that. I went through what you went through. I was accepted and loved. But I just felt like fish out of water. I always was a little bit different. Everybody went east to go to college. I went west. I just was always, my dad used to call me his left coast daughter. So it was like just that kind of joke, because everybody's over here, I'm over here, and I didn't put my finger on it until we were doing this podcast, really how detrimental it was to growing up. just kind of always feeling like you don't belong, but you know, you're there, but you don't belong. I don't know how
I had
else
a
to say it.
pretty extroverted personality as a young
I can see.
person, but I never, again, you know, I don't know if you've listened to my story, but mine is so,
Mhm.
everything is so jumbled together. What, you know, what is all this stuff from? I would, you know, there were several abandonments in my life, initial relinquishment, then adoptive parents divorce, and my mom leaving, and then my dad remarrying and checking out. And, you know, there's so much that it's hard to always pinpoint. But I do know that early on I felt, you know, and I remembered this tonight because before we got on Zoom with you, I had been in a bit of a funky mood today, and I put some AirPods in and I put yacht rock onto Spotify, and then I had this, I remembered how much my entire life that has been my safe place to put music in and escape from the rest of the world. And that was very, very early on, like as far back as I can remember. Back then it was a transistor radio with a one ear, like, I don't know why they couldn't figure out two at that time, but they didn't.
Just the cord.
Yeah. So anyway, yes, all those feelings. And I guess the way that I am able to articulate it now is that I never felt at home anywhere. I didn't feel home. And when I finally did meet my biological family and had those roots, I felt like other people and at home and accepted and not weird, you know.
Not weird.
I know in my family, I'm the weirdo. And I mean, really, they think I'm weird.
And we love her that way. Thank God.
So
Yeah, everything that you're saying sounds familiar to me. Yeah,
When you were talking about your biological family, when you met them and you're looking around the table, when I met my biological family on my mom's side, she wasn't there obviously, but I just remember like I laughed really loud and then they all laughed really loud because I was always the loud laugher. I still am, obviously. Like sometimes on the podcast we have to cut that. So I was like, oh, like other people are loud and embarrassing too. You know, I just remember thinking, oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary. You know, a couple of things, you know, one respect in which I think it was detrimental to me growing up not having that knowledge was that, so I mentioned, for example, that I had some musical talent, which I was hoping actually to develop into a musical career. And when I started college, I was a music major. But I was never sure whether fully to commit to it. And in fact, I didn't commit to it, and I changed my course of study into something else after a year. And I think that my uncertainty over whether to commit to it was an uncertainty over whether I had it in me. Like there's just this one thing that family history gives you, I think, is a little bit more of a sense of maybe where you can go, what your potential is, and to have a model, either positive or negative, of where you can take certain things. And I don't know, I mean, the fact that my birth mom was able to make a living, like be a professional in her creative field. I just think about what kind of influence that would have had on me in this highly counterfactual world where I was raised by her. Whereas, you know, I, as I say, the family that I grew up in was not a family in which people, you know, pursued creative endeavors really. And so it left me kind of, there's a sense, again, I wouldn't have articulated this way back then when I was a teenager.
No.
But I think there was just this sense of, well, I don't really know what's in me. I don't really know what my potential is and what my real strengths are.
Same.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Trying on a lot of hats sometimes too to make them fit.
Right. So I think that is a loss. It's a loss. And then the other thing about not feeling part of the tribe, you know, I was lucky enough to visit. I was lucky enough to visit Sicily a few years ago, and well, actually, it was like 16 years ago now. My adoptive family on my dad's side are descended from Sicilian immigrants. And so I had the privilege of visiting some of these hill towns that had family names to them. Like, I kind of recognize a lot of these names because they were last names of various parts of the extended family and friends of the family and so on. And it was really interesting, but yet I was acutely aware while I was looking at all these places that I didn't see these places as my ancestral.
Right.
Yes.
Never felt like it. Just, I couldn't make, I even kind of tried, I think, to
me too.
feel that connection, but I just never did. I just felt like, oh, this is really interesting. I'm looking at these people's roots.
That's how I have the most German name on the planet, and I don't have any German in me. And growing up, it was so German in the Midwest, and I didn't have a connection to it. But boy, those Irish. Well, this has just been such a great conversation. I feel like we could talk for hours. You're so interesting, and I really want to follow up and hear what happens when you figure out how to reach out.
With your ongoing story, we need to update each other.
It's in progress. And I think there's a sense in which reunion is always, for those of us who are either fortunate or obviously it can be tragic. But even for those of us who are lucky enough to have good reunions, maybe in a sense it's provisional, or at least it's always in progress. My decision to appear on the podcast and talk with you was a step for me, because now that I'm talking in a way that other people can hear, I don't know how it's going to be received by people in my bio family or adoptive family. And again, I think a lot of adoptees, have that sense that, well, it's all provisional because we were rejected once. And there's just that kind of inchoate feeling that, well, it could happen again.
Mm-hmm. Like we're always waiting for the other shoe to drop.
It's terrifying that Sarah and I actually, we're doing this together, and it's a lot for us to put this out there because it's not what we normally do in that way. And we'll text each other like, I wonder if someone's going to get mad, or, we still have that. I mean, all this time later, you think, and no one's done anything yet or said anything, but we don't know. They could be not happy. So on either side, I don't know.
That's right. So, speaking broadly, I feel like for us, as good as it feels, certainly for me, because I regard myself as one of the lucky adoptees, to have my bio family back as family, there is still a sense in which it's a gap or a chasm that can never really fully be bridged.
Yeah.
And that my relationship to both my families have these kind of tenuous aspects to them, reinforcing that sense I think that we all have as adoptees as kind of being loners.
Yeah.
In the cosmos.
Very much. Yes.
The rejection thing is it's a big fear deep down in all of us.
I think I'm just more comfortable solo in life. I don't know. I don't mean, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Yes. With my little headphones and some yacht rock. Little Lionel Richie.
We're going to have to play some yacht rock later for this episode.
Well, obviously we'll be in touch, Tony. We'll see you on Twitter and we'll stay in touch. And please do update us.
Yeah. And
thanks for doing this and to sharing all of this with us. Really appreciate it.
I can't thank you enough for inviting me on. It was lovely to talk to you. Yes, you can find out more about what happens in this story, because I'm not at this point, you said something about being at a certain age where you kind of don't care.
Yeah.
I'm kind of
actually
there.
I think I say don't give a fuck.
I believe you said that. Yeah. I think that those were your words. Yes, but yes. I'm obviously at this point I've put a lot of myself out there in the world, and I'm going to.
Well, I really appreciate it. You're very candid and honest and vulnerable, and it's really great to you're like one of my favorite Twitter people.
Yes.
So
And
really
we'll help
appreciate
other
it.
people too. There was a young girl today on Twitter who was nervous. And I said, it helps to have the age thing. You just don't care as much.
Yeah.
And your voice is going to help so many. So
I do hope so. Yeah. I've heard from people who, and it's touching to know that we can reach people.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank
Tony.
you.
We'll
Thank you
talk to
so
soon.
much.
Thanks again. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.